From the University of Texas at Austin, KUT Radio, this is In Black America.
So we wanted to take a look at how with that context of the data that we have today, plus what happened in 1921, it really does give you a different view and a different appreciation for what was built, what was lost, how it was lost. And as much as I think sweeping this story under the rug was about protecting those who were guilty, the way that we connect this back to the media data and measurement that we do today is it was also about sweeping under the rug, African-American achievement.
Charlene P. Corley, VP of Diverse Insights and Partnerships with Nielsen. Tulsa, Oklahoma's Greenwood District of 1921 was home to 10,000 African-American residents who created a thriving community, an economy fueled by African-American business owners, also known as Black Wall Street. Unfortunately, you won't find that same level of ownership among African-American Tulsans today. With the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre this year, it is evident there is still a lot of progress and justice to be made. But it's also important to spread awareness of the event that continues to impact Tulsa's African-American community. After the carnage, insurance companies refused to honor claims by falsely labeling the attack as a riot, and cited by the city's African-American residents, which limited rebuilding in North Tulsa. Currently, the impact of the massacre is also still felt in home ownership. Tulsa's African-American residents are almost twice as likely to be renters compared with white residents. In fact, African-American individuals in Tulsa have some of the lowest rate of home ownership in the city. I'm Johnny O. Henson Jr., and welcome to another edition of In Black America. On this week's program, the true cost of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre with Charlene P. Corley in Black America.
Looking at academia, there are scholars and there is work being done now to try and put a dollar amount on some of that recovery, what the reparations total would be, if we decided to really pursue that at a national scale. But for Tulsa in particular, I know that there's work being done to try and capture that. And what I will say about it is, again, you're 100 years later, and while thankfully there are still a few survivors and many, many descendants of that community, we're only able to even calculate material recovery. Right, like monetary recovery.
On the evening of May 31st, 1921, and in the early morning hours of June 1st, thousands of white citizens, aided by authorities, violently attacked the African-American Greenwood District in North Tulsa, Oklahoma. In the course of some 12 hours of mob violence, white Tulsa reduced one of the nation's most prosperous African-American communities to ash and killed an estimated 300 citizens, mostly African-Americans. The removal of Black Wall Street in Greenwood wasn't just about destroying a community. It limited the narrative about what African-American community had achieved and how it was destroyed. The devastating effect of that massacre has had a lasting economic impact in North Tulsa today. While the U.S. Census estimated that African Americans make up more than 15% of Tulsa's population today, data shows that there are just 5% of the city's small business owners, and just 3% of African American households in Tulsa have a six-figure income, while 4 times as many African American households make less than $10,000 per year. Recently, In Black America spoke with Charlene P. Corley with Nielsen regarding the true costs of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre.
And then, between the size of the classrooms and the mentoring from teachers, that was really what I needed, not just the academics, but it was everything else too.
You've been at Nielsen for 12 years. Have you been in the VP position, or what was your first position when you came on board?
My first position when I came on board was actually as a part of our management development program. So I was an emerging leaders associate. So the first 2 years with Nielsen, I spent on different project rotations, learning the business, learning how to serve our clients, how we measure audiences, how we recruit in diverse neighborhoods, what's the methodology. that we use to come up with, television ratings or audio ratings. So those are my early years in the company. And then I went on to be client service rep, both in the local television and the national television business. So working with, different markets across the country, from Burlington, Vermont to to Norfolk, Virginia. And so I really got to learn and understand different perspectives when it comes to, who's making the decisions about media at different levels, and who's doing the work on the ground, both locally and nationally, and the data that it takes to make the media business run. And luckily, in the fall of 2020, that's when I moved into my current role. So I pivoted from client service into our diversity, equity, and inclusion team, and that's when I was also promoted to vice president. So instead of, championing representation in media as just a passion project, now it's my day job. Very blessed to be on this team.
Now, in your current position, what do diverse insight and partnerships entail?
So that really entails our new focus as Nielsen is, fully committed and focused on media and measuring audiences now after some different changes, splitting our company in recent months. But with that focus on media, we're able to then look at all of the data that we're collecting, because at the end of the day, we measure audiences, and audiences are made up of people, right? So it's our job to understand what people are looking for on television, on radio, in their podcasts. So we have information around who makes up that audience. But what our team likes to do is look at all of that information and say, where can we surface even more detailed or nuanced stories to help champion a community, to help drive equity for a community, or to get our clients thinking differently about why they should value particularly underrepresented communities. So, Nielsen has for so long measured on, the basics, so race, ethnicity, age, gender. And I'm really proud of the work of our team expanding what diversity really can mean. So not just women, but women over 50, not just Black, Hispanic, and Asian, but also Native Americans and what's going on in that community. So we really do try to look at all of the different assets that we have and where can we find stories that matter and connect the data that we have for someone with trends and opportunities for our media clients.
How did Nielsen become involved in understanding the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre?
So almost as soon as I took this job and became aware of the timing around the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, I knew we had an opportunity to be a part of this important conversation. Mm-hmm. And so we started taking a look at the data that we collect about, what do we know about the Tulsa market, about the different people in Tulsa, audiences in Tulsa. And we wanted to look at, where were African Americans in that community today on these different metrics of ownership. When you understand what Greenwood was able to accomplish and in the time frame that they were able to accomplish it, not just, Blacks surviving, but thriving, building wealth, what would have been generational wealth, all lost within a matter of hours. And so we look at that, especially now with the tag of 100 years later, and say, some people might say, oh, that was so long ago. That, I've heard so many times in my upbringing, that was a very long time ago. You just need to get over it, just move on. Mm-hmm. But there's some accountability work that has to happen if you want to move past something. And part of how we make the case for accountability, for taking that opportunity to have that conversation, is we go through the data. So when we looked at that, different metrics of ownership, so, small business ownership or home ownership, what's that foothold like today? How have African Americans in Tulsa recovered? And, they're still catching up. So, this is indicated in the data that Nielsen collects, but also from, groups like Brookings Institute and Human Rights Watch have also captured, just a fraction of, business ownership. Just a couple of years ago, I think was just, 1% according to Brookings Institute. And we, in our data, showed, single digits as well. When you look at some of the research that's been done around not just ownership, but, who's influencing these decisions in Tulsa, the business and the economic decisions, for every white, there were 18 white executives for every one Black executive in Tulsa today, from some recent research out of the community. And, just looking at how long it is taking for that recovery, you can tie it directly back to, the fact, imagine if at least a single insurance claim had been acknowledged, in 1921, so that folks weren't starting from scratch. Imagine if, it didn't happen at all, and folks, African Americans who are in Tulsa now would have inherited that business or that home, would have gone to college instead of having to, rebuild or trying to self-fund or work your way through. So those things matter. And those, 100 years is just a couple of generations. And that's made a complete difference one way or another for so many Americans. So we wanted to take a look at how with that context of the data that we have today, plus what happened in 1921, it really does give you a different view and a different appreciation for what was built, what was lost, how it was lost. And as much as I think, sweeping this story under the rug was about protecting those who were guilty, the way that we connect this back to the media data and measurement that we do today is it was also about sweeping under a rug, African American achievement. And when we look at trends in media and representation today, controlling that narrative or limiting the narrative of what Black talent can be on screen is still happening. So it was important for us to interject in the conversation based on the unique data and perspective we have as Nielsen and experts on audience measurement.
Ms. Corley, I wanted to, and hope you can articulate this, how did Greenwood become Greenwood? How did these African Americans come to that particular section of North Tulsa and build that community up? Can you address that for us?
I am by no means the expert.
Okay.
And there are certainly scholars who are the experts and have devoted their lives to tracking and capturing the story of Tulsa. What I do know is, you have to go back to, the 5 civilized tribes and the, sort of deal that was made with the U.S. government to relocate Native Americans from the East Coast or different regions along the East and the South into the Midwest. And among those Native Americans were also enslaved African Americans. And so everybody got shipped out over to Oklahoma. Long story short, the land that they quote unquote gave turns out was rich in oil. And so the ownership of those resources now, we're saying, okay, well, it was okay when we thought that y'all were just out there and you were going to, build up something that we were okay with. But now you're building something that's surpassing what we have. And that's, I think, when the second looks, I can imagine, started coming towards Tulsa. I mean, there's been so much great reporting just in this last, 2 weeks about really walking through the level of advancement and achievement that the Greenwood district developed from, a caravan of folks who were, relocated out there to business owners and entrepreneurs and scholars and, all these different great descriptors, but really a thriving community when you get down to it. And I'm not doing the full story justice by any means.
Ms. Corley, I wanted to ask, because you articulated in your previous statement about insurance companies, are we talking about the insurance companies that we know today?
I am not sure about if these are, the companies that existed back then are still in operation today. But, I think there is definitely some similarities or connections that we could probably make to and not just, I'm not picking on the insurance agency, but different decisions that were made in a different time that did advantage, a set of business owners and maybe disadvantage the African American community. We have to assume that certain companies of a certain age or track, that those kinds of decisions were made along the way. I'm not aware of any that existed in 1921 that are still in operation, but what we do know is that none of the residents that filed claims in Tulsa in 1921 received that payout. The insurance companies and media at the time labeled it as a riot.
Right.
And that language was very intentional, again, controlling the narrative through the media to say, well, this is something you all caused, so we don't owe you, anything on these claims. tying it back to the work that Nielsen does to build trust with the community, to go and recruit with the community and report on, the trends happening. There's so many different examples of our community being, taken advantage of. Hey, I paid this insurance claim for 40 years,
exactly,
or insurance premium for 40 years. You knocked on my door, you sold me this policy, and now when I need you, this is a scam. And so there's kind of versions of that story across communities, across history, and that still manifests in distrust of different financial institutions, different investments, different banks. We lag in those kinds of metrics as well across the country, and it's not enough for us to just say, oh, African Americans aren't investing. We also, in a report we did earlier this year on women over 50, it was important for us to make a statement in that around, there are different cultural and community reasons that folks are rightfully hesitant. And so if folks want to do business with communities with African Americans, you also need to understand that you may have to start with rebuilding trust. And so again, the more that we can use what has happened previously to provide context for what we're measuring now at Nielsen, that's the work that our team really takes pride in doing.
Ms. Corley, looking at the metrics that you all are using, comparing the white home ownership and business ownership in Tulsa today versus African American home and business ownership, how far apart are they?
Yeah, it was significant. The census puts the Black population in Tulsa around 15%.
Mm-hmm.
And even at that 15%, our data showed that, today only, 3% of Black households in Tulsa had a six-figure income. Since that was double digits for white Tulsans. Just 5% were labeled in our data set as small business owners. And we know that, with 15%, of the population, especially giving consideration to what was present in 1921, there really could have and should have been more progress than that.
Looking at the data, hypothetically, if at all possible, how many years will it take? Now we're at the 100th anniversary. Mm-hmm. How many years will it take for African American Tulsians to gain what they lost in 1921, if you can calculate it at all?
I learned a lot of things at FAMU. I did not learn how to calculate that. But what I will say is there are actually, again, looking at academia, there are scholars and there is work being done now to try and put a dollar amount on, some of that recovery, what the reparations total would be, if we decided to really pursue that at a national scale. But for Tulsa in particular, I know that there's work being done to try and capture that. And what I will say about it is, again, you're 100 years later, and while thankfully there are still a few survivors and many, many descendants of that community, we're only able to even calculate material recovery, right? Like monetary recovery. There's, when you look at trauma and, the loss of life and just loss of opportunity, I don't know how you would calculate that. There's an estimate of around, I think, 300 folks dead, but not even, the graves have been located. Some estimates of at least, more than 1,200 homes along, when you think of like 35 blocks were destroyed. Right. So, that's the homes, that's the schools, that's churches. And there's reports that say, over, I think it was nearly $2 million in damage claims were filed. And some of the estimates put that figure today at around $27 million if they were been filed for the same properties. So there's plenty of work being done trying to say, well, what would 1921 equal in 2021 dollars? But when it comes to calculating how to be made whole, that's definitely some hard work to do.
I understand. Looking at Tulsa home ownership, does it mirror any other city of its comparable size with the low rate of home ownership?
I'm not sure about another city, but when we did look at, what I can say is we looked at ownership overall for African Americans, And it does lag, compared to white home ownership. There's, of course, been improvement over the years, which, progress should always be applauded. But, this is, I think, important to consider that the story, unfortunately, of Greenwood and how it was destroyed is not it's not just a one case. There's so many different instances of communities being wiped out. And they may not have had the luxury and prestige of Tulsa's Greenwood, but, they still had, ownership and thriving communities. And so what we see in Tulsa has definitely, when it comes to, a community being wiped out and having to rebuild, has played out across the country. And so I think seeing that same pattern of African Americans still trying to recover, even, 2 or 3 generations later, is something that we do see across the country. But the rates of home ownership we actually saw were similar with that lagging white counterparts across the country.
Now, I read somewhere where laws were passed to make it difficult for African Americans to rebuild, and some of the property that was in the Greenwood area was taken over by white citizens.
You read that correctly.
Having said that, so there were some land and property losses associated with the massacre, but also African Americans being denied to come back in their community to rebuild. Is that so the case?
Yeah, so from the research that we've done, that was in fact the case. So on top of, we're going to have this media campaign around labeling this a riot started by the residents of Greenwood themselves. They, so that we don't have, there's no financial responsibility from insurance. On top of that, there was also policies that limited their ability for those who were ready to go and rebuild. And said, okay, by some miracle, I've got the resources I need to move forward now and just kind of start over. And there were all kinds of different attempts to limit what that rebuilding could look like, and intentionally left out the folks who had built up Greenwood. And we are still seeing that, while there's some initiatives for business owners in that community, Black business owners in that community, again, it's still not near what it was. And there's additional work that's been done recently, I think in Washington Post, around, how the price point now to own a business in Greenwood is pricing out some of the local business owners. And again, going back, adding that historical context to the data we collect today, it's not for lack of trying, but,
right.
After 100 years of policy, or if not policy, just in practice, of excluding a certain community, that manifests, that helps delay further the rebuilding efforts.
Ms. Coley, before we run out of time, why is it important for us to understand this moving forward?
Absolutely. I think, especially when I pull it back to the importance of media and the power of media today, as storytellers, this tragedy is something that was nearly lost. And I think had it not been for some of the recent programming that uncovered the story and opened people's eyes to it, like, Watchmen and Lovecraft Country, in addition to, years of documentaries, of course. But when folks really saw Watchmen take that incident and incorporate it into their show, folks, were shocked. Many audience members were shocked to discover that this part of the story was real. The superheroes maybe make-believe, but the villains of Greenwood that night were very much real. And this was something that was ignored throughout our history and not taught and not talked about. And so, people's understanding of Black Wall Street is only just now starting to really become widely known. And I think that is a tragedy, that we have the power to tell those stories, not just for African-American history, but American history. We should all take pride in what was built in Greenwood. We have the ability to continue to change the narrative for African Americans in this country by telling the whole truth by allowing for more roles today, more genres, more types of content and perspectives, especially on screen and especially in, at the news desk or in the genres where people are really being informed of their ideology. And so I think it's so important to talk about what happened in Tulsa in 1921, to acknowledge that this is something that wasn't just a 1 or 2 night event and then it had no further impact, that the recovery is long, and that we should continue to look for the stories that need to be told and the stories that need to be told differently. And I hope that the work we're doing at Nielsen will continue to do that.
I guess the $100,000 question is the state of Oklahoma and the city of Tulsa addressing the lasting economic impact of the 1921 massacre?
I hope so. I think there's a lot of work to do. I think if you ask the survivors of the attack and their community, I think there's much more work to be done. And I definitely want to acknowledge, I know that there's folks who have been working on this literally longer than I've been alive. And so I thank them for all of the work, trying to get this story told, trying to get news coverage. I can't recall another year where there was so much coverage, not just about what happened then, but like how it's impacting now, what was built, what was lost, what's the conversation on reparations, how have laws impacted. I think there's so much more to do, but I'm grateful to the people who are continuing the fight to make sure that the survivors and their descendants in Tulsa can have some type of repayment for what was lost.
Yeah, I echo your statement. Neither can I remember, and I've been doing this for almost 50 years, so this has been a groundswell of information coming forth. Any final comments, Ms. Corley?
I will leave final comments as thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this very important and solemn occasion. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about the power and influence of media and the opportunity that we have to change the conversation here to make sure that stories like Greenwood, like Black Wall Street are not lost. And that if there's anything else that we should be telling, if there's other context that we should have for what's happening today for African Americans and all underrepresented communities, I look forward to uncovering that and seeing how the media industry is going to tell those stories too.
Charlene P. Corley, VP of Diverse Insights and Partnerships with Nielsen. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions as to future In Black America programs, email us at inblackamerica@kut.org.